Hey bro, what took you so long? Try to find a way around.
In the words of 20th century pop rock band 9 Days, F.E.A.R is the story of a girl who cried a river and drowned the whole world, and while she looks so sad in photographs, I absolutely love her when she smiles. Which is never. F.E.A.R opens with alarms blaring as F.E.A.R and his army of clone troopers overtake an Armacham facility. With the utmost urgency, you need to kill your way through swaths of replicas on your way to take out F.E.A.R. And when I say the utmost urgency, I mean your boss drops you off at the crime scene like your roommate would drop you off for a shift at Safeway.
Jankowski, you in position?
Just say the word.
All right, move it out.
It should be no surprise to you after all my gripes about the series' wafer-thin storytelling that this game is a game-length chase. Your target perpetually 10 minutes ahead of you. You're chasing after Rogue Commander F.E.A.R, who in turn is chasing after Alma, the little girl who's causing all kinds of violent trouble, who also happens to be his mom. The story concludes as Harlan Wade tries to liberate Alma and she liquefies him. You reach F.E.A.R, and before you upload a bullet into his forehead, he reveals that he's your brother, which makes you both the children of Alma. It turns out you weren't Psychic Commander material like him, so they plot holed Point Man into becoming Neo from the Matrix and placed him in the US Army, then the F.E.A.R unit. But you're not deep underground in Armacham's terrifying facility for a family reunion, you're there to blow it up, so hopefully Alma goes away and the psychic nightmare can end forever. You do just that, and then you realize that no, this is not how this is going to work. F.E.A.R succeeded in 2005 in huge part because it took advantage of its PC exclusivity to demonstrate what the bleeding edge of graphical and AI technology looked and played like. This was during a time when any technically minded game could seemingly reinvent what was possible, but F.E.A.R also demonstrates that it's a product of its era in ways that are a bit less flattering. If you were playing PC games back then, you made sure that your quick save key was conveniently mapped. In an era before more convenient checkpointing, you might find yourself unintentionally save scumming encounters kill by kill to avoid losing a bunch of progress after a haphazard death. This isn't exclusive to F.E.A.R by any means, but it winds up being an outlier among the latter, more mainline games in this series. The game's campaign feels quaintly simple and straightforward, almost lacking in features. It's also not immune to cringe, like listening to the soldier you connect with late in the game hitting on your coworker immediately after your helicopter crashes.
It's you I'm worried about.
Yeah, I'm fine. As long as I don't move.
Just let me know if you need a little mouth-to-mouth.
Don't make me laugh.
You think I'm joking?
And then there's another incredibly common issue with playing PC games of this era today, namely getting them to work at all, especially on higher resolution displays in aspect ratios that didn't really exist yet. But enough bitching and moaning, this game was a technical tour de force 20 years ago. It's pretty incredible that Doom creator id and F.E.A.R producer Monolith made games that look so incredibly similar despite being developed independently of each other with their own proprietary technologies. If you were none the wiser, you might assume that F.E.A.R and Doom 3 were running the same engine, although the environments of Monolith's game are a little bit more spare than id's. Both games are defined by extremely sharp lighting, courtesy stencil shadows, a CPU-intensive process. The visual effect of these ultra-hard-edged shadows is heightened by playing in higher resolutions. These are, unfortunately, a graphical technology dead end, and a firm reminder of a future that would never come. I chat about them a bit more in my Prey 2006 review, one of the last mainstream games to use them, in my recollection. Like Doom 3, every surface seems to have a slightly glazed, damp clay look to it. This carries over to the human models, making them look about as creepy as anything the game intended you to be freaked out about. There are also plenty of thin, round guardrails in here too, a staple of both games. As a PC exclusive for a time, F.E.A.R also got to show off its high-resolution textures from time to time. Well, they were a big deal back then anyway. Throughout the game, you get little opportunities to gawk at promotional posters that aren't chunky garbage, and then read handwritten schedules and notes. F.E.A.R features some destructible barriers and objects, but where the violence to inanimate things shines is in the parallax mapping of wall damage. Chunks of the environment will look like they are blown out in a firefight, but it's a then new trick. It's just an elaborate texture without any actual deformed geometry, something that would have been difficult for contemporary processors and video cards to handle. With the game's visual emphasis on the scene within a short throw of your character, it's understandable that it's not great at portraying far-off terrain in an era before high poly counts, elaborate skyboxes, and highly detailed open worlds. Helicopter rides are cinematic, but staring out a bit too far towards the skylines is a little less so. There's probably a big reason why you travel over so much water. The city in the distance looks like 1997 Simcopter in comparison. And then we get to the physics, a feature set that was still blooming in F.E.A.R's time, leading to some cadavers that are just as capable of animating awkwardly as any other game. You have to remember, F.E.A.R was on store shelves just a few years after Ragdoll and Corpses made their mainstream debut thanks to Havoc middleware. But F.E.A.R does stuff with physics I didn't expect from games at the time. In my review for Deus Ex Human Revolution, I wondered why they would fill the world with so much detail if they weren't going to let you interact with it. It's an observation that could be made for the very sequels of this game too. Well, F.E.A.R demonstrates why. Letting them sit statically on their virtual shelves opens the possibility of them conspiring to create a massive technical catastrophe. Step on things, roll over them, or do nothing with them at all. There's so much physics jiggling and vibrating in here at times that it sounds like the apocalypse is about to tee off. It truly becomes a horror element all its own. One example came in Perseus Mandate, where a bunch of gas tanks sitting on a series of shelves will just start clattering chaotically with minimal input. But once you get used to how innovative and fresh F.E.A.R was technically, or don't really care because the game is so old at this point, the metaphorical sheen starts to wear off. Not the literal sheen, that always seems to be poking you in the eye in this era of shiny, plastic-looking textures everywhere all the time. No, I'm referring to F.E.A.R's art direction, which on the whole is just boring. As the game kicks off, you get a taste for its cinematic chops. Its visual minimalism matches what the game was capable of technically, in-engine, in real time back then. It's intimate. It carefully uses a black and white palette. There's great blocking, and most importantly, it's to the point. It effectively frames Fettel's brutality and the horror of the connection he and Point Man share, even if it's relatively arbitrary and doesn't amount to much story-wise. Inversely, by leaning on real-time cinematics, the game can't really describe the shape and motivation of a formidable army of clone soldiers outside of the fact that you have to mow down a whole hell of a lot of them. But once you're in-game, things feel less imaginative. F.E.A.R and Doom 3 are different games in different genres thematically, despite their technical similarities, but its game was extremely proud of how cool looking their horror shooter vision was. Launching a year later, F.E.A.R feels less inclined to make such a statement. Its world is populated with generic enemies and generic environments, punctuated by some kinda creepy shit. Offices look like offices, but not in a way that entices you to enjoy the setting. Industrial zones are boring, making their tedious layouts that much more difficult to push through. You shoot dudes who look like standard military combatants. Even when you're battling heavies and those drone things, it's like, really? This is all their imagination could loan them? Where the game truly demonstrates some artistic flair visually is in its most dated elements, because despite releasing in 2005, this game has a severe case of Y2K-itis. The entire interface is draped in graphical design tropes of the era, like geometric techno fonts that were popular in just about everything, like EDM album covers. Then there are the persistent lens flares, even when there's no light source to feasibly generate them. Of course, the most common elements are the bullet ripples from your slow-mo escapades and explosive detonations that mimic the Matrix. All this really needs are some enemies in leather dusters, but I think Deus Ex stole all those. The sound design, however, is unimpeachable and maybe the most artistically impressive component of the game. The acoustics of the firearms and the combat overall are incredible. Heavies groan when they die, signaling that your extended duel with them is over. Enemies scream as they perish, and their anguish is modified in slow-mo. This may have been copied to death in the past 20 years, but in 2005, this was pretty amazing. The music, it maintains suspense, but its loops aren't very interesting. It just seems to take space in the most serviceable way possible, honestly. Okay, now it's time to dive into the fun part. People may enjoy the game's horror and Alma's antagonism, but running around and shooting dudes is the reason why F.E.A.R didn't just disappear beneath the waves when it came out. I mean, it's not like the series was some big seller anyway. Combat in F.E.A.R is visceral. You're ducking behind cover, hoping it's good enough to not get shot at. You're watching not just where the enemies are, but where they can be, because they can find cover and navigate levels nearly as well as you can. Shooting enemies feels like a severe act of violence. Bullet hits and especially headshots feel like they work immediately. Enemies don't feel spongy and damage feels substantial. By agreeing to the terms of each act of violence, every effective burst of gunfire becomes a death sentence for any virtual entity who happens to be on the other end. Killing dudes just feels good here. It's a direct connection, a specific form of violent communication. This game features plenty of artifacts that accompany a shooter of its vintage. In a time before left trigger, right trigger shooter action, the shift key gives you a 2x zoom or a distant zoom with scoped weapons. As someone who grew up with PC shooters in the 90s, this feels like a missing link in shooter evolution. You'll find no better example of this quality of life change than the very sequels to this game. But playing on PC, you may honestly not even care that much because of the precision that a mouse gives you. On the other hand, playing on PC meant I kept accidentally hitting the T key when trying to reload my gun. I know I could just rebind the key, but The first F.E.A.R also features the ability to lean, which is how developers decided to advantage players in an era before snap to cover. You approach a corner and lean around it. It's a subtle effect, almost like Pointland is pivoting in 3D space around his abdomen, but it works sometimes when you need just a little bit of an edge. There are plenty of explosives you can toss or blow up, leaving you with a satisfying ringing ear effect that lingers for a bit if you're too close. By the sound of it alone, Pointman has a really kludgy walk, like he's clumsily using 3 or 4 legs to move around. Speaking of which, there is close quarters melee combat, including some special moves detailed by combos in the splash screens. It seems like melee was supposed to be a lot more ambitious and used far more often than I ever actually did. But when push came to literal shove, the butt of whatever weapon I was using worked good enough. The game does serve up some fun softballs from time to time in the form of turret sequences when you've already spent a ton of energy and ammo blowing them up inside Armacam. Here you get to mow down tons of anonymous military dudes. Watch out though, you'll be knocked out quickly if you're not keeping tabs on every angle enemies can arrive from. Throughout F.E.A.R's levels, you'll find plenty of pickups. You can stash away up to 10 medkits, which I actually did at a point, and pick up additional armor since it was that era of video gaming too. You'll also find glowing items that permanently bolster your health and slow-mo meters. The tools of your trade are your guns, and lucky for us, they are really hefty and effective. You can only carry 3 at a time, learning from Halo, it seems, which necessitates a rotation of weapons as you run out of ammo for your current blasters and stumble upon some new tools. It's a natural feeling progression. There are your standard military boom boomers and burst mode rifles, but then there are more sci-fi themed guns, like this laser rifle thing that turns enemies into skeletons. My favorite gun is the high caliber penetrator that also pins enemies to walls with the satisfaction of Painkiller's stake gun. There are like 3 sniper rifles for some reason, but the death ray is the best one. The shotgun, the table upon which most violent video game feasts are served, is fine, but in its ideal environment, that is, up close and personal, it is a literal blast to explode people into chunky marinara. It's actually one of the few times that enemies will explode or jib in this game, as their bodies usually retain their full rigidity in death regardless of what you do to them. Oh, how incredible a Soldier of Fortune-esque body damage system would have worked in here. There are dual pistols, but like all video game pistols, fuck 'em. Grenades are your typical affair with several types that dole out specific damage depending on whether your foes are biological or mechanical. It's paint by number stuff here. As we already know, F.E.A.R's combat is augmented by the game's well-known association with slow motion shenanigans. I've splashed about this already, but tapping that button and watching the screen go super sharp as your enemies get murked in an avalanche of ammunition and rippling geometry is really cool. It's so cool that you'll forgive so much about how much stupid stuff the game puts you through just because you can enter a room and convert a squad of bad guys into inanimate objects in one of the coolest ways possible. But uniting all these combat components is the game's legendary goal-oriented artificial intelligence. The enemies you encounter aren't interested in sitting still. Once they're aware of your presence, they'll take full advantage of the environment to take you out. Yeah, they can occasionally stick behind a single point of cover, requiring you to flush them out, but they'll demonstrate all kinds of fun behavior, like jumping through windows dramatically to get in or out of your way. Their radio chatter is constant and interesting rather than just noise, conveying real information like body counts, orders between soldiers, and tactics into the open air. Each encounter feels tactical, like a fencing match of give and take, of weighing options and making choices. Sometimes they feel like puzzles to solve. You have to pay attention to what's going on and keep moving, preventing you from camping in place, which, isn't a thing that I do. Definitely not. Enabling the AI to shine are this first game's braid-like arenas that allow you and your opponents to encircle each other in levels designed to grids in 45 and 90-degree angles. F.E.A.R's combat chemistry works because all of these components are precisely measured. It's not that the AI is so complex that it can't be replicated over 2 decades later, it's that the levels were of a certain design, and the weapons were of a certain weight, action, and feedback, that it creates a unique friction. It's this friction that encourages the player to overcome what the game throws at you, something subsequent games have a tougher time with as that chemistry changes alongside gamer expectations of a shooter. Smoke from explosions can effectively obfuscate what's going on, creating a pause in the action and making shooting into the unknown in hopes of hitting someone kind of feel badass. Since nothing can ever be perfect, enemies have a habit of spotting you as soon as a hit scan can be drawn between your model and theirs. Even if the high contrast lighting and vastly underlit levels gave the impression that you might have some stealth options, you don't have them. Enemies will have no issue striking at you when you're not even aware that they're there. Oh, and did I mention how much I hated the game's flying drones, which are clearly the cliff racers of F.E.A.R? Of course I did. They're so crappy that at least once they clipped through the door and killed me. And then there are the supernatural enemies, blah blah blah, blah 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 blah. But while the game's intricate, even claustrophobic levels permit F.E.A.R's combat chemistry to work so effectively, they're also the game's biggest curse. In an era before walking simulators became recognized derisively as pretentious wastes of time, this game is a hecking walking simulator. There is a lot of downtime between enemy encounters, which is an interesting thing to say for a game that's an action shooter at its core. It punctuates the time you're not outmaneuvering generic military dudes with, well, a lot of nothing. But it's this downtime where the game's horror ambitions can fumigate with hallucinations, jump scares, and other flash-in-the-pan horror bits that are the horror tropey candy corn of the series. The first game in particular feels like a horror attraction at times, not all that different than Max Payne 2's Address Unknown theme park, minus any of the fun and lacking much in the way of context or meaning, or character, or interesting props or sequences of illuminating backstory with clever writing that doesn't man. Instead, you do get stuff like disintegrated people. Lots of them. Random Alma sightings, of course. Here's some flickering lights, because those are freaky. Falling ceiling tiles are definitely scary in real life, so obviously they're scary in a video game. What about when there's blood dripping from ceiling tiles? That's bad. I'd, put a maintenance ticket in for that. Or what about bones falling from a hole in the ceiling? That doesn't seem great either. The game isn't entirely cheap in arbitrary thrills though. F.E.A.R scenes of hallucination serve as a pillar of its storytelling, providing exposition, detailing what characters are doing or are motivated by, or they're just hallucinations. Downtime in a video game is just fine and dandy, but there's another big problem with F.E.A.R as a walking simulator. These levels are so fucking boring and tedious. I mean, what happens when you have fun combat, but a pretty weak story to justify each new encounter, or why you're fighting to begin with? It's an age-old question for game designers. I invented a fun new mechanic, what the hell do I do with it? In my Max Payne series review, I talk about how the second game is burdened by a tedious warehouse tour, but that eventually ended. It would be something to celebrate if it wasn't capped with an awful sniper section. F.E.A.R's answer is to send you through seemingly endless locations that start fine enough, but then feel like they're little more than padding so the game doesn't end in an hour and a half. There are big swaths of this game amidst painted over cinder blocks that feel like filler. There's a reason why some shooters stick to multiplayer, because killing randos can justify your murdering mechanics far easier and cheaper than any authored campaign can. Armacam's headquarters is the setting of the game's middle third, or what feels like the game's middle 30 hours. It starts out exciting enough as you arrive by helicopter on rooftop for a dramatic fight, but then you're tasked with wandering through an incredibly unrealistic amount of maintenance sections before reaching the office cubicles nested within. If the game had presented an open cubicle farm, that'd be one thing, maybe even exciting, but F.E.A.R breaks up the office space for the sake of gameplay. You are going to see so much Armacam promotional material and swag in this building, which work well to sell you on how hardcore these guys are about being participants in the American military-industrial complex. It's nuts, but not quite as nuts as the completely illogical layout of what's supposed to be a building that hundreds of people work in. The design of these levels, despite being almost entirely linear with some down and back spurs, feels like it borrows from the chaotic randomness of Citadel Station. Because of the illogical layout of the facilities you fight through, it's easy to get lost, because the game also neglects to include much in the way of landmarks or points of orientation. This carries into the expansions too. As you play through these levels, you wonder why any rational company or community would design and build out so many illogical spaces. Cities aren't built like this. Corporate headquarters aren't built like this. You're genuinely not going to remember much of anything about these settings except for these sections toward the end where Armacam trucks are zooming after you down tight alleyways. I definitely remember those. F.E.A.R also borrows plenty of tropes from early 3D shooters, like warehouses full of crates, ladders that are clunky to climb, sewer levels, easy electrical hazard puzzles, grates, vents, and vending machines. There are some interesting demonstrations of detail from time to time, like in some of the complex machinery you encounter. It's not as showy or interesting as the stuff that lines the corridors of Doom 3, but there's really not much in the way of flourish or fun here anyway. It's painted cinder block walls as far as the eye can see. This is a city without people, and yet it features plenty of the places they would probably live and work, like never-ending warehouse districts, industrial districts, office buildings, a decrepit apartment complex, on, punctured by bloody violence. This makes for an extremely lonely experience where nearly all of the humans you encounter are the ones you're also tasked with murdering. Your F.E.A.R coworkers are a rare sight, and anyone else tasked with fighting with you tend to be evaporated on a whim by Alma. And then there's that one guy with the weird face that you meet in the heart of Armacam's corporate headquarters, Mapes, who tasks you with some stuff before ultimately revealing that he's a trash human. Oh, his final moments are exciting. But here's the thing. Even with the boring levels to wander through, the boring enemies to defeat, and the boring story that barely seems to exist, F.E.A.R works well because the combat works so well. I mean, watching the game is a slog, but playing it, you are engaged. Even as the levels go overlong and you just want the stupid game to end sometimes, you're still anticipating the next encounter. You know that once you hear the radio squawks or the whirring of helicopter blades, you're about to engage in some real-time chess, and you'll need to take inventory of the environment around you to maintain an advantage. Time disappears when you're discharging ammunition, but it tends to chug when you're not. The Stanley Parable taught us that mundane office environments could be fun to navigate and explore, even without their embellishments, so it doesn't seem like much of a leap that Armacam's could too. But that's not what happened. Who really wants to be dumped into a corporate headquarters and spend half your time navigating its oversized and cruel maintenance levels? I can't imagine it's some large number of people. It's slight, but the game does incentivize some exploration by hiding medkits and stat boosters in corners just off the beaten path. It makes these spaces feel slightly naturalistic and even contemporary even 20 years later. F.E.A.R sets up quite a bit narratively that doesn't pay off, but with how low of a priority storytelling is in this game, you'd be forgiven if you got to the end, felt unfulfilled, and then didn't really care. If this had been the only F.E.A.R game, it probably would have been better for everyone. But this was not the end of F.E.A.R, oh no, and the franchise will certainly test your patience from here on out. Hey, this would be a great time to mention that while I don't make a billion videos a year, YouTube doesn't seem to be providing you, my subscribers, with an easy ability to keep track of what I'm up to. So, while you should definitely like and subscribe and hit the bell and all that other crap, you should also sign up to become a free member of the Nth Review Patreon. There, I make sure you get updates on upcoming projects and releases, especially when YouTube won't keep you up to date. If you do decide to support the channel financially, you get in the end video listings, you get access to periodic members-only FAQs, and special Discord channels as well. Check it out at patreon.com/TheNthReview.